am going to continue a thing that I started on my SoundCloud, but I'm going to move to YouTube because reasons. Also, I never make videos, and I feel like I should start doing that again. If you listen to my SoundCloud or are remotely involved in the GeeKon press stuff, I'm going to start out by explaining what GeeKon is to my YouTube audience, because I don't know if y'all have heard of it. It's a really cool, awesome thing that started fairly recently, where we, Housing, puts on all of these really awesome, super nerdy and geeky events. Like, there was, last year in Bruce, for example, we had like a Star Trek Command trivia game thing. It was really cool. Anyway, this upcoming year in February, we're going to be holding it again, where there's a bunch of different events you can go to based on what kind of like nerdy things you like to do. We're going to be working in conjunction with Mini Acon, which comes through each year, as well as will be followed up by this really cool academia-based convention-y thing on comic books. I don't know, it's really rad. Anyway, today I'm going to talk about, to continue from my SoundCloud thing, low versus high fantasy. In my last one I spoke about high fantasy, and I'll link you guys to it down there, or wherever it's moved to. I'm sure it's moved already. Anyway, I'll link it to you so you guys can go and listen to me talk into a microphone, yay, about what high fantasy is. Recap, high fantasy is typically based on a world that is not our own, or a similar world to ours but has no relation to what we view the Earth as. Usually, but not always, has lots and lots of different races, like dwarves and orcs and elves and la-di-da. Think Lord of the Rings. Magic is usually very grandiose and this big, fantastical thing, and low fantasy is usually on Earth, or something very similar to Earth. Very frequently the history of the Earth is similar or exactly the same as ours, and so therefore they've been affected by it. Magic is usually, if it's even there at all, sort of a more for mundane tasks, more like by accident than by purposeful grandioseness. Something that also differs low fantasy from high fantasy is high fantasy usually has like one big evil baddie bad guy. Batty McBatterson is the guy. Yeah, Batty McBatterson. While in low fantasy, the bad guy isn't necessarily this like uber evil black versus white blah thing. It's something a lot more relatable, or at least a much smaller scale. Science is a thing. It is widely accepted. Usually dragons don't make an appearance, and more often than not, it's human-driven. The only race that is in these primarily are just humans. Sometimes giants or even trolls will make an appearance, but they aren't typically a part of the main cast. They're just sort of there. They exist and they may encounter them. It's also very much character-driven. It's a lot more about the journey of the character and how they've grown as a person, and how they've come from being either a devil-may-care or like sex-crazed person to like, I want to help people be happy. They're usually all-around good guys, that sort of concept, or underdog good guy, but they're not like heroes, I'm gonna go battle some bad stuff. Like, they just sort of find themselves in the issue. So, now that I've given you a very probably confusing overview, very generic, I promise there's a lot more to it. My research was pages and pages and pages and pages long. I spent like 3 hours and I still can't quite make sense of it because it's one of those like really generic, it's kind of a catch-all for anything that doesn't fit high fantasy or sci-fi fantasy, which I didn't even know had its own name, but it does. They're science-driven. Woo! all. It's confusing, and there's a lot of, but sometimes it, and also it will, but other times it won't, and, exceptions. So, Harry Potter. In my first podcast, I talked about how I thought that Harry Potter was high fantasy, but after doing all of my research, or I thought Harry Potter was low fantasy, or a combination of both, but after doing all of my research, I realized that Harry Potter really does fit the high fantasy a lot better, because even though it is based on Earth, and it is a place that is affected by our version of history, and even though Harry did grow up in a primarily Muggle society, he does spend a majority of his time in this other realm, this make-believe place for us, which is the Wizarding World. And I originally made the argument that the parallel world, because it's still connected to this one and it's not even like a different dimension, it's just a hidden nook, it would be considered high fantasy, or low fantasy. Sorry, I'm a little confusing myself. After doing a little bit more research, I realized that high fantasy can also encompass things that are like tunnels to other worlds, like Narnia, or Harry Potter. And if you notice, if you're, a big enough Harry Potter nerd, and even then, even if you're not, you've probably noticed that a lot of them don't use what we use daily. Like, science isn't really a thing, it doesn't matter, because they can use magic for everything. And, like, electricity is sort of a weird pseudo thing that's primarily driven by magic. And, so sciences aren't really a thing, and physics are obviously not a thing because Wingardium Leviosa, like, poof, I'm up in the air. So, yeah. Also, though Harry Potter is very character-driven, it is very much about Harry growing up and becoming a man and becoming a better person, and Hermione and Ron's development as well. Like, even though it's very character-centric, there is definitely one big uber bad guy, and that is Voldemort, and he does all this uber bad stuff, and he is the, like, almighty evil genocide Hitler of the Wizarding World. And because he is such a powerful foe, that does fit more in the high fantasy category than the low fantasy category. He's not some evil uncle, he's like janky, man. Jank. So yeah, apparently it's more high fantasy than low fantasy, and I apologize. But I do have a series that I think straddles both the high and low fantasy really, really well, to a point where literary scholars, I found a bunch of articles, are like not quite sure how to categorize it. Game of Thrones. Game of Thrones is a primarily human-based cast. They are governed by eye color. They have some fundamental forms of the sciences that they use. They have a definite agreeability to physics. It's in medieval England, even though it's not necessarily our history. It's similar enough that it could possibly be, like a mirroring. And it is, it's not really fighting any big, overarching baddie McBatterson. Not really. There's no one person that everyone's after, or that everyone's terrified of. There's lots of little people that everyone's terrified of because that's who it affects them in their tiny region. And then it gets bigger, and then it gets bigger, and then you get Joffrey, and then it gets bigger. Joffrey sucks. So that would qualify it for low fantasy. But there's definitely dragons. Like, oh my goodness, the Khaleesi. Don't mess with the Khaleesi. It's also very much like plot-driven. It's not, like, while there are some characters that you get a little bit more in depth about, there's a lot of characters that all play different parts in the progression of this Game of Thrones. It's more about who is going to rule where, and, like, the little mini battles and all of the little, like, stuff that they do amongst each other than it is about any particular character growing. Like, for a while I was like, oh, it's about Rob growing as a no. Oh, it's about Sansa growing as a maybe not. Is it about... No, it's not about anyone in particular. It's about all of these families and all of their heads and all of their crazy psychosis and the backstabbing and all of that stuff. That's what it's about. It's not about a character. And it is different enough that it could possibly be considered a parallel or alternate world. And magic does play a role in it, and the magic that does exist is very scary and very dark and fairly grandiose. I mean, like Shadow Person, Shadow Baby, whose gestation period was like a day. Shadow Baby. No. So that puts it in high fantasy, really, if you think about it. So here we have this series that is straddling both high and low fantasy by being super uber plot driven and having magic and dragons, but being primarily, actually almost entirely, humans and no really one big bad guy. But there is the others, the White Walkers. They can be considered the other, but because they're not so very accepted as the other, like they're not that well known beyond the people who live in the north. That's sort of a Stark and Winterfell, you know, parallel up. They understand what the other is. And some people who have sent their guides up to be crows, and some families who've like intermarried and moved around know about it, but they all think of it as just some sort of funny fantasy, haha, lore. But as, if you've been watching the series, they have definitely begun to become one of those overarching big baddie McBattersons, and they're really terrifying. But it's not just one person, it's like a big lump of them. And so I'm wondering if we're ever going to find out if there's some one big person. Because I haven't read the book, so don't spoil it for me. I'm sorry. I'll read them eventually. I want to, I just don't have time. Anyway, I was talking about the TV show, but I was talking about Harry Potter books. Yeah. Multiple mediums. I love that. I love that fantasy can like permeate so many different mediums that it's accessible to everyone. But yeah. So that was probably really confusing, and I'm sorry that I don't have a lot of structure today. I just kind of read a bunch of articles and decided to go. But what do you think? Do you think Game of Thrones is high fantasy or low fantasy? And what about Harry Potter? Do you think it fits really neatly in the high fantasy, or are you kind of like me where you're like, but they're dipping their toes in the low fantasy area? Or at least they started out that way. Leave your thoughts in the comments here or on the WordPress blog where I'm going to post this. I will see you all eventually.